At 03:16 hours on June 6, 1944, British Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery stood in the operations room of Mess Faulknor off the Normandy coast, watching the first wave of Allied troops hit the beaches. He held a typewritten document in his hand, a document he had presented to Eisenhower, Bradley, and every senior Allied commander 6 weeks earlier at St. Paul's School in London. The document stated, in Montgomery's own words, that British and Canadian forces would capture the city of Caen on D-Day itself, within 24 hours of landing. Caen was 9 miles inland from Sword Beach. The plan called for armor to push through German defenses, bypass strongpoints, and take the city before nightfall. Montgomery had been absolute in his certainty. He told Eisenhower the plan was not ambitious. It was realistic. Caen would fall on June 6th. By June 7th at dawn, Montgomery was still standing in that operations room. Caen had not fallen. British forces had advanced 3 miles inland. The 3rd Infantry Division and the 27th Armored Brigade had reached the outskirts of Caen, but were stopped cold by the 21st Panzer Division. Montgomery read the field reports and said nothing. By June 8th, Caen still had not fallen. By June 15th, 9 days after D-Day, Caen remained in German hands. By July 1st, 25 days after the invasion, Caen was still German territory. The city Montgomery promised to capture in 24 hours took 33 days to fully secure. 33 days of brutal urban combat. 33 days of Allied casualties mounting into the tens of thousands. 33 days of Adolf Hitler pouring reinforcements into Normandy because Montgomery's failure to take Caen gave the Germans time to organize a defense that nearly broke the Allied advance. And through all 33 days, Montgomery refused to admit he had been wrong. He rewrote his own plan. He told Eisenhower that capturing Caen on D-Day had never been the objective. He claimed the real plan was to draw German armor away from the American sector. He said the grinding battle for Caen was exactly what he had intended all along, a deliberate strategy. Historians have spent 80 years debating whether Montgomery lied about his original plan or whether he genuinely believed his own revised version of events. But the men who fought at Caen knew the truth. They had read the orders. They had been briefed on the objective. They knew they were supposed to take Caen on June 6th. And they knew that Montgomery's ego, his refusal to adapt, his insistence on rigid offensive operations against dug-in German armor cost thousands of lives and nearly gave the Germans enough time to turn Normandy into a stalemate that could have collapsed the entire invasion. If you want to see how one man's pride almost destroyed the most important military operation in history, hit that like button right now. Every like helps us share these forgotten truths. And subscribe if you haven't already. We're digging into the real stories they don't teach in history class. Back to Montgomery and the disaster at Caen. Montgomery was 56 years old on D-Day. He had spent his entire adult life in the British Army. First World War veteran. Wounded at Ypres in 1914. Rose through the ranks during the interwar years. By 1942, he was commanding the 8th Army in North Africa. That's where he made his reputation. The Battle of El Alamein in October and November of 1942. Montgomery defeated Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps and drove the Germans out of Egypt. The victory made Montgomery a hero in Britain. Churchill loved him. The British public loved him. The press called him the greatest British general since Wellington. Montgomery believed it. He genuinely believed he was a military genius. And in some ways, he was. Montgomery had strengths. He was meticulous. He planned operations down to the smallest detail. He understood logistics. He knew how to build up supplies, coordinate air and ground forces, and execute set-piece battles. He was also good with soldiers. Troops liked him. He visited units, gave speeches, made men feel like they mattered. Morale in Montgomery's armies was generally high. But Montgomery had weaknesses. Massive, crippling weaknesses. The first weakness was his ego. Montgomery could not admit mistakes. Ever. If an operation failed, it was someone else's fault. If a battle went wrong, his subordinates had misunderstood the plan. If casualties were higher than expected, the enemy had been stronger than intelligence reported. Montgomery never accepted responsibility for failure. The second weakness was his rigidity. Montgomery fought battles the way he had been taught at Sandhurst in 1908. Methodical advances, massive artillery preparation. Overwhelming force concentrated at a single point, break through, exploit, destroy. It worked at El Alamein because the terrain was open desert and Rommel's supply lines were stretched thin. It worked in Sicily in 1943 for the same reasons. But Normandy was not open desert. Normandy was hedgerow country, bocage. Small fields surrounded by thick hedges and sunken roads, terrain that favored defense, terrain where armor couldn't maneuver and infantry had to fight for every field. Montgomery did not adapt his tactics to the terrain. He tried to fight Normandy the way he had fought North Africa. And it didn't work. The third weakness was his relationship with other commanders. Montgomery did not respect Americans. He thought American officers were amateurs. He thought American soldiers were undisciplined. He made no effort to hide his contempt. Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. First Army, despised Montgomery. George Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, called Montgomery a tired little fart and suggested the best way to speed up the Normandy campaign would be to shoot Montgomery and promote someone competent. Even Eisenhower, who tried to maintain Allied unity, privately described Montgomery as insufferable. But Eisenhower couldn't fire Montgomery. Churchill wouldn't allow it. The British public wouldn't allow it. Montgomery was a national hero. So Eisenhower had to work with him. And Montgomery knew it. He knew he was untouchable, and that knowledge made him more arrogant, more inflexible, more willing to ignore criticism and push forward with plans that were clearly failing. The planning for D-Day began in early 1943. The Allies had agreed that the invasion of France would happen in 1944. The target was the Normandy coast. 5 beaches, from west to east, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The Americans would land at Utah and Omaha. The British and Canadians would land at Gold, Juno, and Sword. Montgomery was appointed commander of all ground forces for the invasion. That meant he commanded both the British Second Army under Miles Dempsey and the American First Army under Omar Bradley. The plan called for a rapid breakout from the beachhead. The Americans would push west to capture Cherbourg and its port. Then they would swing south and east. The British and Canadians would push inland, capture Caen, then advance southeast toward Falaise. The goal was to create a lodgment area, bring in reinforcements and supplies, then break out into the French interior and race toward Paris and the German border. Caen was critical to the plan. The city sat at a junction of roads and rail lines. It controlled access to the flatlands south and east of Normandy, flatlands where Allied armor could operate. If the British took Caen quickly, they could push into open country and threaten the German left flank. If the British failed to take Caen, the Germans could use the city as a fortress and anchor their entire defensive line. Montgomery understood this. He stated repeatedly that Caen had to fall on D-Day. He told Eisenhower on May 15, 1944, during the final strategy conference at St. Paul's School, that Caen would be in British hands by the end of June 6th. He was not presenting this as a hopeful objective. He was presenting it as a certainty, a fact. Montgomery's plan for taking Caen relied on speed and shock. The 3rd British Infantry Division would land at Sword Beach at 07:25 hours. They would push inland immediately. Armor from the 27th Armored Brigade would follow. The plan called for the armor to bypass German strongpoints and drive straight for Caen. Infantry would mop up resistance. The key was momentum. Keep moving, don't get bogged down. Hit Caen before the Germans could organize a defense. On paper, the plan made sense. In reality, it ignored several problems. First, the terrain between Sword Beach and Caen was not suitable for rapid armor advance. Narrow roads, hedgerows, small villages, all of it favored defense. Second, intelligence indicated that the 21st Panzer Division was stationed near Caen. The 21st Panzer was a veteran unit. Experienced crews. Panzer IV and Panther tanks. If the 21st Panzer counterattacked before the British could consolidate, the advance would stall. Third, the plan assumed the initial landing would go smoothly. No major delays, no confusion on the beaches, no traffic jams. But D-Day landings were always chaotic. Delays were inevitable. Montgomery's plan had no flexibility, no contingency for setbacks. It was a rigid timetable that assumed everything would go perfectly. June 6, 1944, 0725 hours. The 3rd British Infantry Division hit Sword Beach. The landing went relatively well compared to Omaha. German resistance was lighter than expected. Casualties were manageable. By 0900 hours, the lead elements of the 3rd Division were off the beach and moving inland. The 27th Armored Brigade landed at 0930 hours. Sherman tanks of the Staffordshire Yeomanry rolled off the landing craft and onto the sand. The plan called for them to move immediately toward Caen. But there was a problem. The beach exits were congested. Vehicles were backed up. Engineers were still clearing obstacles. The 27th Armored Brigade sat on the beach for 40 minutes waiting for the road to clear. By the time the tanks started moving inland, it was 10:10 hours. Already behind schedule, the lead units of the 3rd Division advanced toward the village of Hermanville. They took the village by 1100 hours. Light resistance. Then they moved toward Beeville. Heavier resistance. German infantry with anti-tank guns. The advance slowed. The 27th Armored Brigade finally reached Hermanville at 1200 hours. 2 hours behind schedule. The brigade commander, Brigadier George Errol Pryor Palmer, wanted to push forward immediately. But infantry support was still catching up. Pryor Palmer was told to wait. He waited 30 minutes. Then he moved. The tanks advanced toward Beeville and Lebacy. The plan was to bypass German strongpoints and drive for Caen. But at 1400 hours, the lead tanks ran into German positions at Lebacy Wood. The 21st Panzer Division had moved into position. Panzer IVs and anti-tank guns. The British tanks took fire. 3 Shermans were knocked out in the first 5 minutes. Pryor Palmer pulled back and called for infantry support. The advance had stopped 6 miles from Caen. At 1600 hours, the 21st Panzer Division launched a counterattack. 50 tanks and supporting infantry pushed north toward the beaches. The counterattack hit the gap between Sword and Juno beaches. For 2 hours, it looked like the Germans might split the British landing zone. But the 21st Panzer's advance was stopped by British anti-tank guns and naval gunfire from offshore destroyers. The Germans pulled back at 1800 hours. The counterattack had failed. But it had also stopped the British advance cold. By nightfall on June 6th, British forces were 3 miles inland from Sword Beach. Caen was still 6 miles away. Montgomery's promise to take Caen on D-Day had failed within 12 hours of the landing. The question was what Montgomery would do next. June 7th, 0600 hours. Montgomery received reports from the front. The 3rd Division had not reached Caen. The 27th Armored Brigade was dug in near Lebacy. The Canadians at Juno Beach had advanced 5 miles inland but had not linked up with the British. The Americans at Omaha had barely gotten off the beach. Utah Beach was more successful, but forces there were still consolidating. Montgomery's first reaction was to blame the delay on bad weather. The channel had been rough. Some landing craft had been delayed, some units had landed in the wrong positions, but the weather had not stopped the landing. The landing had succeeded. The problem was the advance inland. Montgomery issued orders for a renewed push on Caen. The 3rd Division and the 27th Armored Brigade would attack at 1400 hours. Artillery support, air support. Overwhelming force. Take Caen by nightfall. The attack was launched at 14:30 hours. 30 minutes late, the British pushed toward Lebesey Wood and the villages of Epsom and St. Contest. German resistance was heavier than expected. The 21st Panzer had been reinforced. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend had arrived during the night. The 12th SS was a Fanatic unit. Young soldiers, 17, 18 years old, recruited from the Hitler Youth, poorly trained in some respects, but absolutely committed. They would not retreat. The British advance ran into the 12th SS positions at St. Contest. The fighting was brutal, house to house. The 12th SS held. By 1800 hours, the British had advanced less than a mile. Caen was still out of reach. Montgomery ordered another attack for June 8th, same plan. Artillery, air support, push through. The June 8th attack achieved similar results, minimal gains, heavy casualties. The Germans were not retreating, they were reinforced. More Panzer units were moving toward Caen. The 12th SS. The Panzer Layer Division. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division. Hitler had decided that Normandy was the main invasion, not a diversion. He ordered his panzer reserves to move to Caen and stop the British advance. By June 10th, Montgomery faced a problem. The plan to take Caen in 24 hours had failed. The plan to take Caen in 4 days had failed. The Germans were building a defensive line anchored on Caen, and Montgomery's attacks were grinding forward at enormous cost. The 3rd Division had suffered over 1,000 casualties, the 27th Armored Brigade had lost 40 tanks, and Caen was still 5 miles away. Any reasonable commander would have paused. Reassessed. Changed tactics, looked for a way to outflank Caen instead of battering straight into German armor. But Montgomery was not reasonable. He was convinced that his plan was correct. The problem was execution. His subordinates were not pushing hard enough. The troops were not aggressive enough. The solution was more attacks, stronger attacks, overwhelming force. Montgomery ordered Operation Perch. Operation Perch was launched on June 10th. The objective was to encircle Caen from the west. The British 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, would push south from the beachhead, swing around Caen, and cut the city off from the south. At the same time, the 3rd Division and the 51st Highland Division would attack Caen from the north. Pincer movement. Classic maneuver. The 7th Armored Division moved out at 0600 hours on June 10th. They advanced toward the town of Villers-Bocage. The advance went well initially. Light resistance. By June 12th, the 7th Armored had reached the outskirts of Villers-Bocage. The lead units pushed into the town at 0800 hours on June 13th. Then, disaster. A single German Tiger tank commanded by SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann appeared on the road east of Villers-Bocage. Wittmann's Tiger was part of the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion. The Tiger was one of the most powerful tanks in the world. 88 Memmer gun, thick armor, nearly invincible in the right hands. Wittmann saw the British column, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, all stationary, no infantry support, no flank security. The British had advanced too fast and left their flanks exposed. Wittmann attacked. He drove his Tiger down the main road through Villers-Bocage and opened fire. In 15 minutes, Wittmann destroyed 14 British tanks, 15 personnel carriers, and 2 anti-tank guns, single-handedly. The British column panicked. Vehicles tried to turn around. Some crashed. Some were abandoned. Wittmann's Tiger continued firing. By the time British infantry arrived and forced Wittmann to withdraw, the 7th Armored Division's advance had been shattered. The division pulled back from Villers-Bocage. The encirclement of Caen from the west had failed. Meanwhile, the attacks on Caen from the north were also failing. The 3rd Division and the 51st Highland Division launched coordinated assaults on June 11th and June 12th. They made small gains, a few hundred yards. But the German line held. The 12th SS Panzer and the 21st Panzer were not retreating. By June 14th, Operation Perch had failed. Montgomery called off the attacks. British forces had suffered over 2,000 casualties. They had advanced less than 2 miles. Caen remained in German hands, and now the Germans had 4 full panzer divisions concentrated around Caen. The 21st Panzer, the 12th SS Panzer, the Panzer Lehr, and the 2nd Panzer. That was more German armor than the British had faced at El Alamein. Montgomery should have been alarmed. He should have realized that attacking Caen head-on was no longer viable. But instead, Montgomery rewrote the narrative. On June 15th, Montgomery sent a message to Eisenhower. The message stated that the fighting around Caen was proceeding according to plan. Montgomery claimed that the objective was not to take Caen quickly. The objective was to draw German armor to the British sector and away from the Americans. The Americans could then break out in the west. Montgomery said this had always been the plan. Eisenhower read the message and was baffled. He had been at the May 15th briefing. He had heard Montgomery promise to take Caen on D-Day. Now, Montgomery was claiming that holding Caen was never the objective. Eisenhower didn't confront Montgomery. Not yet. He needed the British to keep attacking. The Americans were still struggling to expand the beachhead. But Eisenhower knew something was wrong. Montgomery was lying, either to himself or to everyone else. June 18, 1944. A massive storm hit the Normandy coast, the worst channel storm in 40 years. It lasted 3 days. The storm destroyed the American Mulberry Harbor at Omaha Beach. It grounded Allied aircraft. It stopped all offensive operations. Montgomery used the storm as an excuse for the delays. He told Eisenhower that the storm had disrupted the timetable. Once the weather cleared, the advance would resume. The storm ended on June 21st. Montgomery immediately planned a new offensive. Operation Epsom. Epsom was designed to break through west of Caen and cross the Odin River. British forces would establish a bridgehead, then push toward the high ground at Hill 112 south of Caen. From Hill 112, British artillery could dominate Caen and force the Germans to withdraw. Epsom was launched on June 26th. The attacking force was the British the 8th Corps. 4 divisions, over 60,000 men, 600 tanks, massive artillery support, the largest British offensive since D-Day. The attack began at 0730 hours with an artillery barrage. Over 700 guns fired for 40 minutes. Then the infantry moved forward. The 15th Scottish Division led the attack. They pushed through German positions at Choux and advanced toward the Odin River. Resistance was heavy. The 12th SS Panzer fought for every yard. But the British kept pushing. By June 27th, the 15th Scottish had reached the Odin River. Engineers built bridges, tanks crossed. By June 28th, British forces were pushing toward Hill 112. They reached the hill on June 29th. Fighting on Hill 112 was savage. The 12th SS Panzer counterattacked repeatedly. British tanks fought German tanks at point-blank range. Infantry fought with grenades and bayonets. By the end of June 29th, the British held the northern slopes of Hill 112. But they could not hold the summit. German artillery and counterattacks were too strong. On June 30th, Montgomery received intelligence reports. The Germans were moving more panzer divisions toward Caen. The 9th SS Panzer Division, the 10th SS Panzer Division, both had been held in reserve near Paris. Now they were moving to Normandy. Montgomery made a decision. He called off Operation Epsom. The 8th Corps pulled back from Hill 112 and established defensive positions north of the Odin River. Epsom had gained some ground. But it had not broken through. It had not forced the Germans to abandon Caen. It had cost the British over 4,000 casualties. And Caen was still in German hands. 24 days after D-Day. Montgomery issued another statement. He told Eisenhower that Epsom had been a success. It had drawn German armor away from the American sector. The Americans were now ready to break out. Montgomery said this was all part of the plan he had laid out before D-Day. Eisenhower didn't believe him. Neither did Bradley. Neither did the British commanders in the field. Everyone knew Montgomery was rewriting history. But no one could stop him. By early July, the Normandy campaign was in crisis. The Allies had landed over 1 million men in Normandy, but they were still confined to a narrow beachhead, 50 miles wide, 10 miles deep in some places. The Germans had 10 Panzer divisions in Normandy. 7 of them were facing the British at Caen. 3 were facing the Americans. The fighting had become a stalemate, a grinding attrition battle, the kind of battle the Allies could not afford. Every day the Germans held Normandy was another day for Hitler to bring up reinforcements, another day to build fortifications, another day for the Allies to suffer casualties they could not easily replace. The American commanders were furious. Bradley wanted to break out from the American sector, but he couldn't break out while the Germans had 7 Panzer divisions concentrated at Caen. Those divisions needed to be pinned down or destroyed. That was Montgomery's job, and Montgomery was failing. On July 7th, Eisenhower flew to Normandy to meet with Montgomery. The meeting was tense. Eisenhower asked Montgomery directly when Caen would fall. Montgomery said Caen would fall soon. He was planning another offensive, bigger than Epsom, more air support, more armor, overwhelming force. Eisenhower asked why the previous offensives had failed. Montgomery said they had not failed. They had accomplished their objective: drawing German armor to the British sector. Eisenhower pointed out that drawing German armor to Caen was not the same as taking Caen. Montgomery insisted the plan was working. Eisenhower returned to England frustrated. He confided to his Chief of Staff, Walter Bedell Smith, that Montgomery was incompetent, but he still could not fire him. Churchill would not allow it. So Eisenhower gave Montgomery one more chance: take Caen, or lose command of ground forces. Montgomery planned Operation Charnwood. Charnwood was launched on July 8th. The objective was simple: take Caen. 3 British and Canadian divisions would attack from the north: I Corps, the 3rd British Division, the 59th Division, the 3rd Canadian Division, 115,000 men, 700 tanks, and for the first time Montgomery requested heavy bomber support: 460 Lancaster and Halifax bombers from RAF Bomber Command. Their target was Caen itself. The city would be carpet-bombed. The bombing began at 21:50 hours on July 7th. 460 bombers dropped 2,500 tons of high explosive on Caen. The city was obliterated. Medieval buildings collapsed. Streets were buried under rubble. Fires burned out of control. Over 3,000 French civilians were killed. The bombing was supposed to destroy German defenses. Instead, it created obstacles. The rubble blocked streets. Tanks could not advance through the debris. Infantry had to climb over shattered buildings. The Germans used the rubble as defensive positions. The ground assault began at 0420 hours on July 8th. British and Canadian forces pushed into the northern outskirts of Caen. Resistance was still heavy. The 12th SS Panzer had survived the bombing. They fought from the rubble, street by street, building by building. The advance was slow, brutal. By the end of July 8th, Allied forces had entered Caen, but they had not taken the city. The fighting continued on July 9th. The British and Canadians pushed through the ruins. German resistance began to crack. The 12th SS Panzer pulled back across the Orne River to the southern part of Caen. By the evening of July 9th, the northern half of Caen was in Allied hands. Montgomery declared victory. He announced that Caen had been liberated. He sent a message to Eisenhower claiming that the operation had succeeded, but Caen had not been fully liberated. The Germans still held the southern half of the city, the industrial suburbs, the bridges across the Orne, and the open country beyond Caen was still out of reach. Montgomery did not mention this. He simply declared victory and moved on to planning the next offensive. Charnwood had taken 3 days. It had cost the Allies over 3,500 casualties, and it had gained only half of Caen. 33 days after Montgomery promised to take the city in 24 hours. The failure to take Caen quickly had enormous consequences. First, it gave the Germans time to reinforce Normandy. Hitler sent every available Panzer division to the front. By mid-July, the Germans had more armor in Normandy than they had at the start of the invasion. Second, it concentrated German armor around Caen. 7 Panzer divisions. That meant the Americans faced lighter opposition. But it also meant the British were locked in a grinding battle of attrition. British casualties in July 1944 were the highest of the entire Normandy campaign. Over 30,000 killed, wounded, and missing. The British Army was running out of replacements, units were under strength, morale was suffering. Third, it delayed the breakout. The Americans could not break out until the Germans were penned at Caen. Bradley's Operation Cobra, the American breakout offensive, was originally planned for early July. It was delayed until July 25th because Montgomery had not secured Caen. That 3-week delay gave the Germans more time to prepare, more time to build defenses, more time to bring up troops. Fourth, it created tension within the Allied command. The Americans blamed Montgomery. The British blamed the Americans for not pushing harder in their sector. Eisenhower was caught in the middle. He spent more time managing personalities than managing the campaign. And fifth, it nearly gave the Germans a chance to stabilize the front. If the Normandy campaign had turned into a stalemate, if the Allies had been unable to break out, the invasion could have failed. Not failed in the sense of being thrown back into the sea, but failed in the sense of being unable to achieve the objective, unable to liberate France. Unable to advance into Germany, the Germans could not win. But they could force a negotiated peace, and every day the Allies were stuck in Normandy was another day closer to that outcome. Montgomery's failure at Caen brought the Allies dangerously close to that scenario. On July 18th, Montgomery launched another offensive. Operation Goodwood. Goodwood was the largest British armored offensive of the war. 3 armored divisions. Over 750 tanks. The plan was to break through east of Caen and push into the open country beyond. The offensive was supported by the largest air bombardment in history up to that point. Over 2,000 Allied aircraft. Heavy bombers. Medium bombers. Fighter bombers. They dropped 7,700 tons of bombs on German positions. The ground attack began at 0745 hours. The British armor moved forward. Initially, the advance went well. German frontline positions had been shattered by the bombing. British tanks pushed through. By midday, the lead units had advanced 6 miles. They were approaching the Borgebus Ridge south of Caen. Then they ran into German defenses that had survived the bombing. The 1st SS Panzer Corps. Panther and Tiger tanks, 88 EME anti-tank guns. The Germans had dug in on the reverse slopes of the ridges. The British tanks advanced into a killing zone. German gunners opened fire. British tanks were destroyed by the dozens. The advance stopped. By the evening of July 18th, British forces had advanced 7 miles. But they had lost over 200 tanks, 1/3 of the attacking force. Goodwood continued on July 19th and July 20th. Gains were minimal. Losses were heavy. By July 20th, Montgomery called off the offensive. Goodwood had failed. The breakout east of Caen had not happened. The British had suffered over 5,500 casualties. They had lost 400 tanks. And the Germans still held the high ground south of Caen. Montgomery issued another statement. He claimed Goodwood had succeeded. It had drawn German armor away from the American sector. The Americans were now breaking out in the west. Operation Cobra had been launched on July 25th. By July 31st, American forces had broken through German lines and were racing into Brittany and toward Paris. Montgomery said this was the result of his strategy. The British had penned the Germans at Caen. The Americans had exploited the opportunity. Montgomery claimed credit for the American success. The American commanders were disgusted. Bradley publicly stated that Montgomery's strategy had been to fail at Caen while claiming it was intentional. Patton said Montgomery was a tired little fart who had stumbled into success by accident. Even Churchill began to have doubts. He visited Normandy in late July and saw the destruction around Caen. He asked Montgomery why it had taken so long. Montgomery gave his usual explanation. Churchill did not look convinced. The truth about Caen is complicated. Montgomery did promise to take Caen on D-Day. That promise is documented. It appears in his briefing notes from May 15, 1944. It appears in the operational plans distributed to commanders. It appears in the orders given to the 3rd Division and the 27th Armored Brigade. Montgomery absolutely intended to take Caen on June 6th. When that failed, Montgomery faced a choice: admit the plan had failed and adapt, or insist the plan had succeeded and rewrite the objectives. Montgomery chose the second option. He began claiming that taking Caen quickly had never been essential. The real objective was to draw German armor to the British sector. This would allow the Americans to break out in the West. Montgomery called this a strategy of attrition. Pin the Germans at Caen. Bleed them. Force them to commit their reserves. Then break out elsewhere. Some historians accept this explanation. They argue that Montgomery did intend to draw German armor to Caen. They point to the fact that 7 German Panzer divisions were concentrated around Caen, while only 3 faced the Americans. This imbalance allowed the Americans to break through. But other historians reject this explanation. They argue that Montgomery invented the attrition strategy after his initial plan failed. They point to the enormous casualties the British suffered at Caen. Over 50,000 killed and wounded between June 6th and the end of July. If the plan was to pin the Germans, why did Montgomery keep launching costly offensives? Why not dig in and let the Germans attack? Why commit British armor to grinding battles that destroyed hundreds of tanks? The most likely explanation is that Montgomery's plan evolved. He did intend to take Caen quickly. When that failed, he adapted. But instead of admitting failure, he reframed the failure as success. He told himself and everyone else that the grinding battle for Caen was exactly what he had planned. And because the Americans did eventually break out, Montgomery could claim vindication. The strategy worked, even if it was not the original strategy. The problem with this explanation is the cost. The British Army suffered casualties at Caen that it could not afford. Britain's manpower reserves were nearly exhausted by mid-1944. Every British soldier killed or wounded at Caen was irreplaceable. The Americans had larger reserves. They could replace casualties. The British could not. Montgomery's grinding strategy at Caen weakened the British Army to the point where it could no longer carry out offensive operations. By August 1944, British divisions were being broken up to provide replacements for other divisions. The British Army in Northwest Europe never fully recovered. Montgomery's ego played a central role in the disaster at Caen. He could not admit mistakes. When the plan to take Caen on D-Day failed, Montgomery should have paused and reassessed. He should have looked for alternatives. Outflank Caen, bypass it, isolate it. Instead, he kept attacking, head on, into German armor. Because admitting that the plan had failed would have been admitting that he had been wrong, and Montgomery could not do that. His ego would not allow it. Montgomery's subordinates knew this. Miles Dempsey, commanding the British Second Army, privately expressed frustration with Montgomery's rigidity. He wanted permission to try different approaches. Montgomery refused. Brian Horrocks, commanding XXX Corps, later wrote that Montgomery's insistence on frontal attacks at Caen cost thousands of lives unnecessarily. But no one could challenge Montgomery. He was untouchable. Churchill supported him. The British public adored him. And Eisenhower needed him to keep the British engaged. So Montgomery continued to command. And British soldiers continued to die. The final phase of the battle for Caen came in late July. Operation Spring was launched on July 25th. Canadian forces attacked south of Caen toward the villages of Verrières and Roquencourt. The objective was to break through and seize the high ground at Verrières Ridge. The attack was a disaster. The 2nd Canadian Corps advanced into prepared German defenses. The 1st SS Panzer Corps was waiting. Canadian infantry and armor were cut to pieces. In one day, the Canadians suffered over 1,500 casualties, the highest single-day loss for Canadian forces in the entire war. The attack gained nothing. Montgomery called off Operation Spring after 24 hours. By the end of July, Caen was finally secure. The Germans had pulled back, not because Montgomery's offensives had broken through, but because the American breakout in the west threatened to encircle the entire German position in Normandy. The Germans had to retreat or be trapped. Caen fell because the Americans succeeded, not because Montgomery succeeded. The battle for Caen remains one of the most controversial episodes of World War II. Montgomery's defenders argue that his strategy worked. The Germans were pinned at Caen. The Americans broke out. The Normandy campaign succeeded. The Allies liberated France and won the war. Therefore, Montgomery's plan was correct. Montgomery's critics argue that the success came in spite of Montgomery, not because of him. The grinding battle for Caen cost tens of thousands of casualties and nearly gave the Germans time to stabilize the front. If the Americans had not broken through, the Normandy campaign could have turned into a stalemate. Montgomery's ego, his refusal to adapt, his insistence on claiming success even when operations failed, nearly cost the Allies the invasion. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Montgomery was not incompetent. He was a skilled planner and organizer. But he was also arrogant, inflexible, and unable to admit mistakes. Those flaws turned the battle for Caen into a bloodbath. Thousands of British and Canadian soldiers died because Montgomery could not accept that his plan had failed. Caen should have fallen in days. It took 33 days. Those 33 days nearly broke the Allied advance. Those 33 days gave the Germans time to reinforce. Those 33 days created a crisis that could have collapsed the invasion. And through all 33 days, Montgomery insisted everything was going according to plan. Montgomery continued to command Allied ground forces through the end of July. On August 1st, Eisenhower took direct command of all ground forces. Montgomery was given command of the 21st Army Group, which included all British and Canadian forces in Northwest Europe. He was no longer commanding American forces. Bradley and Patton now reported directly to Eisenhower. Montgomery resented this. He believed he should remain in overall command. He lobbied Churchill. He lobbied Eisenhower. He argued that splitting the command would create confusion. Eisenhower ignored him. The change was necessary. The American public would not accept American soldiers being commanded by a British officer. Especially not Montgomery. Montgomery's reputation in the United States had collapsed. American newspapers had been reporting on the failures at Caen. Reporters embedded with American units had heard what Bradley and Patton thought of Montgomery. The narrative in the American press was clear. Montgomery had failed at Caen. The Americans had saved the invasion. Montgomery spent the rest of the war trying to restore his reputation. He pushed for bold operations. Market Garden in September 1944 was Montgomery's plan, a massive airborne assault to capture bridges in the Netherlands and open a route into Germany. Market Garden failed. The British 1st Airborne Division was destroyed at Arnhem. Montgomery blamed the failure on inadequate support. He never accepted responsibility. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, Montgomery was temporarily given command of American forces north of the German breakthrough. He stabilized the line and helped stop the German offensive. But he also held a press conference where he implied that British forces had saved the Americans. American commanders were furious. Eisenhower nearly fired Montgomery. Churchill intervened. Again. Montgomery survived again. The war ended in May 1945. Montgomery accepted the German surrender in Northern Europe on May 4, 1945. He was promoted to Field Marshal. He was knighted. He became a hero again in Britain. After the war, Montgomery wrote his memoirs. He dedicated an entire chapter to Normandy. In that chapter, he claimed that the battle for Caen had gone exactly as planned. He said capturing Caen quickly had never been the objective. The objective had always been to draw German armor to the British sector. He said his strategy of attrition had worked perfectly. He took credit for the American breakout. He never mentioned the 50,000 British and Canadian casualties. He never mentioned the 33 days it took to capture a city he had promised to take in 24 hours. He never admitted he had been wrong. Historians have spent 80 years debating Montgomery's performance at Caen. Some defend him. Some condemn him. Some try to find a middle ground. But the soldiers who fought at Caen knew the truth. They had been told they would take Caen on D-Day. They had been told the advance would be rapid. They had been told the Germans would collapse. None of that happened. Instead, they fought for 33 days in brutal urban combat and open-field tank battles. They watched their friends die. They watched their units get chewed up in Montgomery's offensives. And they watched Montgomery claim victory even when operations failed. The men who fought at Caen did not believe Montgomery's revised narrative. They knew they had been sent to take Caen on June 6th. They knew the plan had failed, and they knew that Montgomery's ego, his inability to admit failure, had cost thousands of lives. The disaster at Caen is not just a military failure. It is a case study in the dangers of ego in command. Montgomery was a talented officer. But his inability to accept criticism, his refusal to adapt, his need to always be right, turned a difficult operation into a disaster. Leadership requires flexibility. It requires the ability to recognize when a plan is not working and change course. Montgomery did not have that ability. He was locked into his own narrative. And because he was politically untouchable, no one could force him to change. The result was 33 days of unnecessary suffering. 33 days that nearly gave the Germans time to turn Normandy into a stalemate. 33 days that showed the world what happens when ego matters more than results. If this story opened your eyes to the truth about Caen, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. People who need to hear the real history. Not the sanitized version, not the propaganda, the truth. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are digging into the real stories every single day. The stories they do not teach, the stories that make commanders uncomfortable, the stories that soldiers live through. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you from the United Kingdom, Canada, the United States, Australia, somewhere else? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family fought at Caen. Tell us what you think about Montgomery's leadership. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure the truth about Caen does not disappear into silence. These men deserved better leadership. They deserved commanders who could admit mistakes. They deserved a plan that adapted to reality instead of clinging to fantasy. Montgomery failed them. But we will not fail their memory. We will tell their story, the real story, the story of 33 days that nearly cost the Allies everything.